To OTT Talks Live, a series of conversations with think tankers and policy entrepreneurs working to promote better informed policies all over the world. My name is Enrique Mendizabal, and in this episode, we'll dive into the findings of the 2025 On Think Tanks State of the Sector report, which offers a unique snapshot of how think tanks are navigating today's political, financial, and technological challenges. To help us unpack these findings and discuss what they mean for the future of the sector, I am joined by three guests. Our own Camila Ulloa, Research and Learning Officer at On Think Tanks and Principal Author of the report. Diana Holman, who leads the Knowledge for Transformation project in Africa at GIZ. And Christopher Chibwana, Program Officer in the Gender Equity and Governance Program at the Hewlett Foundation. Through the report, we hope the think tanks have spoken. So today, we want to hear from two leading think tank funders, the Hewlett Foundation and GIZ, about what they think of those findings and what's next for the sector. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. But let's start with you, Camila, then. Why don't you share with us some of the findings from the State of the Sector report this year?
Sure. Thank you, Enrique, and hello, everyone. So the 2025 State of the Sector report is based on survey responses from more than 330 think tanks across 102 countries. And it was enriched with insights from the Open Think Tank Directory, our 25 partners around the world, and of course, On Think Tank's continuous engagement with the community. So as Enrique said before, this year we identified 10 key findings that together provide a comprehensive report, a comprehensive picture of the sector. And for today's discussion, I would like to highlight three of them. So please note that these findings reflect the information reported by the surveyed organizations. And while the sample is large and diverse, it is not fully representative of the global think tank population. However, we believe that it is sufficient to trigger and inform more local conversations. So first, the first finding, it's about optimism for growth in the sector. So for you to know, only about a third of think tanks believe that the sector in their country will grow in the next year, while nearly half expect no change at all. The lowest levels of optimism are found in wealthier democracies and larger organizations. And a potential explanation is that in high-income countries, the space for think tanks often feels saturated by already higher numbers of think tanks, as well as the presence of consultancies, universities, and advocacy groups, which may reduce the perceived relevance that think tanks limit their growth opportunities. By contrast, think tanks in lower-income countries expect more growth, with over 60% anticipating the sector to expand in the next 12 months. This positive response may result from the fact that there's still room for growth. But at the same time, it is precisely in this context where official international development assistance funding cuts, such as USAID withdrawal, affect think tanks the most. So our data show that the effect of a USAID withdrawal was most pronounced in non-EU Europe and the Caucasus, Southern Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where more than 1/3 of think tanks report being affected by this. So the strategic role of think tanks in a donor-driven development system context is as intermediaries providing policy advice and facilitating implementation. Although the context is challenging, especially following USAID's withdrawal and the shortcuts taken by other bilateral donors, they will remain relevant actors for cooperation partners. So the issue they work on is, maybe the issues they work on, or the type of contracts could change, but they will still need it. They will still be needed. So for most of them, it is more about adapting, and they are experts at doing so. Thanks. Thanks, Kike.
Thank you, Camila. That's a nice sort of first introduction to one of the first findings. And that's interesting because it sounds counterintuitive a little bit. That precisely where funding is being cut the most dramatically is where think tanks expect their sectors to grow the most as well. Diane and Chris, let me bring you into the conversation. You both work with policy research organizations, think tanks in Africa, and this is precisely one of the regions where optimism for growth exists, but is also one of the regions where they're being mostly affected by development assistance cuts. Another finding, of course, of the report is that sub-Saharan Africa, as well as other low and middle income regions, are very dependent. Think tanks are very dependent on foreign assistance when it comes to their funding. So, Chris, from your perspective, from private philanthropy and the work at Hewlett Foundation, what do you think explains this optimism for growth among African think tanks?
Yeah, thanks, Enrique, and thanks, Camila. I think I have three hypotheses that sort of, in my mind, explain why there's this optimism for growth, even amidst declining ODA cuts or declining ODA overall, the complete closure of USAID. I think the first, when I look at the portfolio of grantee partners that I work with, and this is I have a number of think tanks within our portfolio that are based in East and West Africa. There's, I think, some idiosyncrasies around how much funding has been lost. So because a lot of the think tanks that we work with are small, and I say smaller in USAID terms. So when USAID was around, they were considered way too small to be able to receive direct funding from USAID. I work with right now in my part of the portfolio, I have about 40 different organizations. And out of those, only one had a direct grant from USAID. The rest were either subs or sub partners of USAID, to the extent that I think some didn't even know that the USAID cuts would actually eventually filter down to them, because they realized later on when the prime partner told the sub partner, who then told them that they'd been impacted by the stop work orders. So I think the aggregate numbers that you see in terms of how many organizations were directly impacted, it does mask a lot of those idiosyncrasies in terms of who was directly benefiting from that funding. So I think that in part explains why there's that optimism. Yes, there's been funding that's been lost, and it's substantial, it's a lot. But I think in terms of the think tanks, the smaller think tanks, that impact, USAID wasn't their main source of funding. I think the other explanation hypothesis that I have is there's also, I think at the same time, we're seeing this increased demand for data and evidence. There's a desire to be more cost effective, a desire by governments and policymakers to be more efficient with how they use resources, which I think somewhat, I guess, not too similar, but if you compare that to the COVID times, for instance, there's an uptick in that type of demand for evidence, which then contributes to think tanks feeling more relevant to the current moment. And I think the other sort of hypothesis that I have, and it's probably not even a hypothesis, there's been concern, at least within private philanthropy, in assisting the organizations, the grantee partners that we work with that have lost funding. And so there's been philanthropic responses to shore up think tanks, to provide, whether it's bridge funding to think tanks, expedite payments, accelerate payments, bring forward payments that were due next year, bring them up to this year, so that people don't lose jobs. And again, that might explain some of that optimism you see. And I guess the final thing that I'll mention is within Africa, for instance, I think there's been a move towards greater collaboration, whether it's forced or whether it's organic. I think an example of that is there's a current call for proposals from this Africa think tank platform that's managed by the African Union that's calling for consortia of organizations to come together to try and collaborate and work together. That I think has sort of energized the field in a way, and sort of, I guess, made people not forget necessarily, but become a little bit more optimistic about the future. So maybe those would be my hypothesis for why there seems to be this optimism.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Chris. Also, I think, I mean, if I can add one more, I think is that at least from on think tanks, we are hearing more and more about young Africans that are coming up with ideas around think tanks or think tank type organizations. And I think this is something that I can also say is happening in other parts of the world and in other middle and low income regions, whereas Latin America or South Asia or Southeast Asia, where we see sort of recent graduates, students, sort of people who are more policy entrepreneurs, maybe into impact investing, that are being sort of knocking on our doors, asking us about think tanks, because I think that will see a niche, or see a space where they might grow, and I think they might be tapping on other types of funds that are not necessarily coming, as you say, from bilateral cooperation, which is being cut, or from philanthropy. But it's interesting that you say that there is a message of support from existing funders, the ones that are not leaving, and that maybe helps with the optimism. I wonder, Diana, if that's sort of a similar reflection. GIZ is entering this project you work on, is entering a new phase, and is making a bit of a bet on think tanks. Why is this the case, or what's behind this renewed interest in think tanks? Is this also a sector that you think is this a sign that you think the sector is also, in its direction of growth?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Camila. Thank you, Enrique, and also ODT for this report. Very insightful. Regarding your question, certainly, I think it's more an investment rather than a bet of German Development Corporation. As you might be aware, and also for the audience as a reminder, GIZ, we are an implementing organization, and we implement on behalf mostly of the German government. And actually, our project was being prepared when there was no clarity about US aid yet, right? So, and the project that I'm heading that started in July this year actually had two predecessor projects. So for more than 6 years, GIZ, commissioned by BMZ, has been invested in this area. So certainly we see that the sector can and should grow, especially at also what Chris referred to. There's increased demand and need for data and information and evidence-based policymaking. And really from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, as well as GIZ, our bet or our investment is really on more evidence-based policymaking, and think tanks are certainly the change agents that are needed for that. So we basically work with think tanks on the one hand to help strengthen them within Africa as change agents, help them connect better with actors within Africa, but also on the global stage. And of course, there's a certain self-interest for the German government, for example, to also have better data, better information coming from Africa to develop strategies, develop interventions that help sustainable and just development in the sector. So certainly, I would say it's beyond a short-term bet, but a long-term investment that we see here.
And this long-term investment makes me think of the types of organizations, or the way in which these organizations will work in the future. Chris, you referred to collaboration. As you said, collaboration, you talked about being forced or organic. Sometimes it's forced because it's difficult, right, to do it. It often requires organizations to sort of stretch their business models or the way they are organized. Do you think that in light of the various challenges that we are facing, whether it's funding or political or other, um, the future of this growth is going to be business as usual, or should think tanks be exploring different approaches, different business models, different structures, different strategies? And what do you think they could be, right? If they're so optimistic about growth, well, how should that growth look like? Let me start with you, Chris, first.
Yeah, I think the sector broadly needs to ask itself some really hard questions. I think given this decline in development funding, is it possible for us to do more with less? Could we be more efficient? Can organizations, for instance, I think, can they share infrastructure and systems? Like, do we need 5, 10 think tanks in a country to each have their own HR function, their own finance function? Is there the possibility of having shared infrastructure that helps reduce overhead, reduce costs, and allows institutions to focus on their core business, which is either generating or brokering evidence, engaging with policymakers and decision makers? And there's the question, what role could AI play in all of that, including in potentially streamlining how evidence is generated and communicated? I think the sector also needs to, this is ironic because the think tank sector exists to essentially drive evidence-informed practice and policy, right? I think the sector needs to ask itself, how much do we use evidence in our own programming, in our own decisions? What evidence is there that our work is being impactful? And how do we measure that? Are we being effective? Because in an era of reduced resources, I think there's a need to demonstrate value for money, a greater need to demonstrate value for money. And so how do we know that our work is making a difference? What among the activities that think tanks do, implement, workshops, trainings, whatnot, what of those activities are the most impactful? And how do we measure and communicate that? I think the sector needs to think deeply about that, given that that's actually the focus of the entire think tank endeavor. And I guess the final sort of question is what you alluded to, Enrique, which is collaboration. That we need, I think we believe at the foundation, for instance, that we need a multiplicity of voices, a multiplicity of actors, even doing the same thing. But how can we be a part of it, an ecosystem that's stronger? So in Africa, how can we have 10 strong think tanks that if you ask if somebody came to me and asked who should we work with, I don't have to pick one or two. I could name 15 that are equally just as good. I think there also exist existential questions, right? Do some organizations need to exist still? Or the private sector does this really well. When one business is struggling, other businesses see an opportunity to try and take up the assets that struggling business has. Could we talk about mergers and acquisitions within the think tank space? Do we need 3 organizations in Kenya doing the same thing? Or perhaps could they be better off coming together and combining efforts? And of course, there's egos and politics and all of that involved, and that's not easy to try to get to agreements to do this. But there are efforts that are actually currently taking place to try and explore that as a way to either reduce cost, achieve greater efficiencies, and improve how think tanks operate within the current context.
I think that's really interesting as well, the idea that often we think about collaboration when it comes to policy influence, or we think about collaboration when it comes to research. That I think you're alluding to that. but it's also collaboration when it comes to covering your kind of business, your back end, right? And a lot of think tanks, especially small ones across the world, have indirect costs that are closer to the 40%, especially if you're smaller, you're dealing with a difficult context. And that's very hard for them to fundraise, regardless of where the funds come. So if some of those indirect costs could be shared among organizations, that could be potentially a way of addressing these challenges. What about you, Diana? What do you think? What do you hope for the future of growth among think tanks?
So I think a very important consideration is what do we mean by growth, right? Is it about size and volume, or is it rather about resilience and impact, right? And I strongly believe in the latter, and I guess it's something for think tanks to think about, how they define success. You already mentioned it. Is it that, is it the amount of money I fundraise every year? Is it the number of employees, or is it rather the impact I have on policies? Is it a matter of measuring usefulness of my work? And I think there needs to be a decision made by every institution if they, are about growth in terms of size, or rather in terms of strength and impact. And also smaller organizations can have a very high impact. When you mentioned about the topic of business model, I think also a lot of think tanks in Africa are highly dependent on international development funds, right? And I guess here it's a question how to be prepared for less funds. I mean, it's unfortunately a certain trend, or maybe also fortunately a trend, that there's more independence. There might be a more push towards thinking about alternative income models, be it more work in consulting, be it about fundraising from domestic donors. So I think there's actually an opportunity or a good reminder to think about what can be other income models to be more resilient in the long term.
That's interesting. I before the launch of the report, we had a conversation with think tanks in Peru, and I want to say that we encourage any think tank that is part of this conversation or is listening later on, if they want to organize a local conversation with their peers, we will be more than happy to support. And we had a really good discussion, and we found that many of the think tanks operating in Peru today are sort of trying to raise funds through a number of income streams, from opinion polls to consulting to membership to partnering with other organizations that might provide them with in-kind support, grants, being part of or associating to universities, so they also develop teaching programs with generate income. So yes, coming up with whatever sources of funding you can come up with, and I think that's something that Majid in the questions has raised, and Erika Schroeder also talks about models that are less dependent on international development assistance. And I think this is what we see among the kind of the new think tanks emerging, right? Maybe they'll come up with some of the good ideas. So we talked about finance. I know that Camila wants to share sort of finding number 2 has more to do with politics. I think we've always said that think tanks are political actors. So we want to know what the effect of politics are on think tanks. Camila, can you tell us what you found in the report, please?
Yeah, sure. So the second finding, as you said, concerned political polarization and how it is increasingly shaping how think tanks operate. So our data show that over 1/3 of organizations report being significantly affected, up 12 percentage points from last year. So we see an increase from last year. And the effects of political polarization are wide ranging, including difficulties in sharing research, collaborating with experts, securing funding, but also maintaining access to the media. East and Southeast Asia subregion reported the sharpest increase from last year, from 7% to 35%, followed by those in Latin America and the Caribbean from 31% to 54%. The Anglosphere and the Sub-Saharan Africa also show an increase in a different way, but still an increase from last year. And these SEP rises point to a deteriorating political environment for policy research. Interestingly, as you can see, the MENA region remains the least affected, although it also shows a rising trend with 50% affected compared to last year. But here's something interesting about our data that shows that where research evidence is highly valued in society, think tanks are less affected by polarization. So 50% of respondents who reported that evidence is not highly valued in their country said that they found either hard or very hard to operate during the last year, compared to just 12% of those think tanks in context that do value research evidence. So here we can see that trust in value in evidence provides protection because it helps organizations navigate political polarization, making them more resilient even in complex environments. And the value of evidence has proven to mitigate polarization regardless the type of regime or a country income level. So in fact, another finding that releases to this discussion is that think tanks in electoral democracies and electoral autocracies report greater policy impact than those in liberal democracies or closed autocracies.
That's really interesting. So to some extent, the high value of evidence creates a bit of a protective aura around think tanks that are dealing with increasing polarization. It doesn't eliminate the impact, but it might help them out a little bit more. Chris, you you support think tanks, but I think your ultimate purpose is better informed policies, right? You want to promote the generation, communication, and use of evidence. And think tanks are clearly an actor. What do you think about the role that the value that society places on evidence plays in this conversation, and what implications do you think this raises for those working with and supporting think tanks?
Yeah, no, I think to even elevate the purpose why we fund think tanks, yes, we want better policies, but ultimately, I think what we want is improved lives. That eventually those policies are better and that people's lives improve. It's interesting when you ask about the value of evidence, and depending on who you ask, when you talk to think tanks, you sort of get into this echo chamber where evidence is everything, because obviously that's what think tanks do. That's the currency that they work with. But I think evidence is only a means. When you zoom out from that word, you realize evidence is just a means to an end. And as my friend Dr. Rona Mijumbi would say, a riot on the street can be more powerful than a p-value. And we've seen some of the most radical policy changes result from activism, from protests. I think we saw that in Kenya last year when Kenya's young people took to the streets to protest an infamous finance bill. And eventually that bill was withdrawn. That didn't take evidence, that just took action. And so whether the evidence said this is good for the country, other factors are just as important. So we need to maintain, I think, a balanced view of what it takes to influence policy. And it's true that I think that data shows that trust in science is low. Trust in governments is low. Trust in institutions, including in think tanks, is low currently. And so I think think tanks need to establish legitimacy, to re-establish legitimacy. And I think there are several ways that think tanks can do that. Being transparent about their funding sources, being transparent about potential conflicts of interest, for instance. I think being transparent around the methods that they use and how intellectually autonomous they are from their funders, but also from politicians. Reestablishing relevance, reestablishing connections with their core constituency, that it's not so much that think tanks are serving foreign interests, but that they do exist to promote a specific agenda, whether it's a national agenda or whether it's to support the government agendas articulated by the government itself. And I think there was a finding around like reduced engagement with the media. I think it's just important, if not more important now, for think tanks to think about how do we engage with the media? How do we center our audience in our communications? Instead of broadcasting the expertise that think tanks have, which is sort of the normal thing that academics do, engage communities, sit down with policymakers, sit down with communities, engage the media to try and amplify those messages. And so I think what I see as the role, your question was like, what the final part of the question was, what role do funders have? I think funders are some funders are more interested in funding specific products, things that could be counted. The State of the Sector report, for instance, is a very specific deliverable that OTT produces, and some funders are very happy to sponsor that because they can take it and showcase it. I think it's those other things that are a little bit harder to justify, where a think tank is investing in the sorts of things that I mentioned, establishing relationships with governments, establishing relationships with the media. Those are very fuzzy. And I think there's a role for funders to play in also being balanced in what we fund, so that we're funding the entire operation. We're funding the entire organization and not just limiting funding to specific pieces of evidence, because as we saw, those won't go that far. We need to be able to invest in the other things as well to ensure that the evidence ultimately gets used.
That's interesting. I sometimes like to say that funders like to see the interview in TV, but they don't necessarily know how the think tank prepare for that interview, how they pay for that interview, right? And something we've heard from the survey, one of the findings of the survey, I think Camila will allude to that a little bit later, but has to do with a continuous interest among think tanks to develop skills around communications. And we've been asking about this, and I think what the response we get is not so much research communication or knowledge translation as it's sometimes referred to, but they're more and more interested in what could be referred to as political communication. Is that negotiation? Is that network building, trust building, that intangible that you referred to, Chris? I think that takes a lot of time and it's not an output, right? And it's very risky. And in an increasingly polarized context, it can be extremely risky, right? Because you can end up building networks and building relationships with the wrong side to some extent when it comes to your own resilience, and funders' ability to respond to that is critical. So Diana, in an increasingly polarized environment where think tanks are saying this affects us even more, what do you think are the roles that a funder, and what can a funder like Gia said that is working with think tanks in Africa could potentially be doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, polarization and stable political condition in general are definitely limiting spaces of think tanks. We see that. I have to say that we as a project, the Knowledge for Transformation project, we work regionally. So we do not support individual think tanks in country, but rather think tanks that work on Pan-African issues. So on the one hand, to be fair, I have to say that the effect on them is probably a little lower than those that are exposed to the national context only. But at the same time, also we try to work with our partners, our partner think tanks, through grants rather than through consultancy contracts, and we try to create those grants in the most flexible manner that we can. we actually asked the think tanks what kind of support they need, and most of our grantees receive support from our side, on the one hand on thematic work, but also on building their own capacities. And on the topic of thematic work especially, there's also a lot of flexibility. So we don't say, work specifically with that institution and deliver this, but rather work with decision makers, which give them flexibility on also adapting to changes that they see on the ground, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, we're not working with think tanks just for a few months, but over several years. So that gives them the opportunity to also adjust in a way to the context that they see in front of them. And we make sure that they can cater to the demand that they see. And we also, on the other hand, we encourage think tanks to create alliances, to support and to link to support networks, which helps them also to access different areas where they can have an impact. So if they happen to be on the wrong side of the spectrum, they might be able to access through different networks the target group that they intend to target. And I just wrote down also what Chris said. I think it's very important to really remember the meaning of trust, because everything that you said, Chris, establishing the think tanks themselves as trustworthy partners is something that will hopefully help them also in the long run, right? Even if there's different parties, different governments coming in with different expectations. I think it's very important, and I would echo that think tanks are transparent about the methods, about how they work, and hopefully are able to keep being linked to the right decision makers.
Very interesting. Thank you. And I think the point you made about the regional work that we've also seen, again, anecdotally from our engagement with many think tanks in the run-up to this report, we've also seen many organizations trying to, some of them reposition themselves as regional organizations or regional think tanks, sometimes because the local context is very difficult, right? So it's a way of protecting themselves by working regionally. Others are trying to sort of open an arm or open a sort of a side of their work that is regional to allow them to navigate these spaces, or organizing themselves. Again, going back to what Chris said earlier, right? Collaborating with more organizations, not just at the local level, but also at the regional and global level, that sort of positions them outside those highly contested political spaces, which is not necessarily the same as saying that the whole society is polarized. I think sometimes we confuse the polarization of the political elite or the political class with the polarization of the whole society.
And I think if I could add to that, I think there's also there's a bit where in some contexts, in some communities, normal people see think tanks as being elite and therefore inaccessible, which is why I think the idea of, I guess, democratizing evidence, like demystifying evidence, making it very much accessible by identifying whether it's through storytelling or whether it's engaging the media to simplify and make it matter. Like, why should communities care? I think we've seen this with the US, for instance, where universities are struggling because communities just don't see the relevance. And so they're fighting these battles alone and nobody's standing up for them because it's not really seen to be community impact beyond educating people, educating kids. There hasn't been that much that's been invested to try and bring these institutions closer to the people. And so I think it's the same risk that think tanks have, that people think, well, you need to be an economist, you need to have a master's degree, a PhD, to be able to engage with a think tank and the issues that a think tank talks about. But that's actually not true. I think there's a need to try and simplify and get think tanks closer to the people.
But do you think that think tanks have sort of created this problem for themselves to some extent, right? They have, in pursuing impact, in pursuing certain relationships, or sort of looking in a certain direction, funders or policymakers consistently, or in addressing issues in an increasingly nuanced or complex way, that sort of detach themselves from the rest. Can I ask Camila, this is not in your, I know you're not going to present this today, but one of the questions we looked at was whether the agendas of think tanks, what think tanks said should be studied in their countries, coincided with what sort of regional or national polls like Afrobarometer or Latino Barometer were saying the public was concerned about. Can you say something about that disconnection or connection between think tanks' agendas and public agendas?
Yes, one of our findings was around that, how think tanks are prioritizing the same topics as some of the public opinion polls in their countries. And we see that in most of the region are prioritizing, the think tanks in most of these regions are prioritizing the same topics, but some of them were not, especially Latin America and the Caribbean, where the public polls were prioritizing topics around security, around crime, and think tanks, the survey think tanks in this region were prioritizing other topics. This also happened, let me just find
I think in Europe, right? In EU, Europe.
Yeah, exactly. Where one of the main topics in the public polls were environment, but think tanks were prioritizing topics around economics, if I'm not wrong.
I think it's the other way around.
Yeah.
I think the public wanted cost of living.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Cost of living and
think tanks were worrying
economics,
about the environment. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
So this is a nice sort of check the think tanks can do and funders can do as well, right? So when presented with an agenda, say, well, yeah, it's fine. It can be think tank led, right? But at the same time, are we building a constituency, right? Are we building connections to what the public wants to hear? I think that can be very, very important. So mindful of time, so I can ask you, Camila, to take us into the third finding you thought would be interesting to share today. And I think that looks more into the organizations themselves and, and the kind of the capacities or skills that they're looking to develop.
Yes, exactly. So we found that organizational challenges, we found that these challenges are organizational size and more about structure and context. So first, one point that we found very clear is that fundraising is the #1 capacity gap globally. More than 70% of think tanks, regardless their size, their budget, or region, said they need stronger skills and support in this area. So this is a challenge that unites the whole sector. This was the same last year, as you can see. But the data also showed that internal structures matter significantly. For example, organizations that identify more as NGOs are more likely to say that they need support in research capacities. So their distance from academic networks may leave them with fewer pipelines for training or methodological expertise. We also saw that think tanks without finance or human resources teams are much more likely to report gaps in those areas. So in some think tanks, capacity shortfalls are not a matter of scale necessarily, but are deeply tied to institutional design. So in particular, the lack of core administrative structures rather than the size of the organization appears to be a most reliable predictor of operational vulnerability in terms of self-identified capacity gaps. So while fundraising is a universal challenge, resilience and adaptability depend heavily on how organizations are structured internally. Also, it is not about the type of funding, either if it's core, project-based, or internal or domestic, but rather about organizations' internal capacities to manage the resources they have. So the project management or the financial planning. Also, beyond these internal structures, we also see a significant technological divide emerging. As some of you already talked about the role of artificial intelligence for think tanks. And here is where I want to raise a clear alert from the data. So AI adoption is raising very rapidly. 71% of think tanks already utilize AI, primarily for research and communications, but the uptake is highly uneven. So in Europe, more than 80% of think tanks report using AI. In South Asia and the MENA region is closer to half. And the barriers are not necessarily lack of interest or motivation, but the barriers are usually tied to infrastructure, to training, and resources. So this could mean that AI could become a new line of inequality in the sector, and think tanks in better resources, research context will accelerate their use of these tools, while others risk being left behind. So the alert is clear that AI adoption could exacerbate the global divide in access to technology. You are muted, Enrique.
Sorry, that covers a couple of aspects of the discussion, right? So it's first the organizational capabilities of the think tank. Christopher alluded to this. You alluded to this a little bit before when you talked about think tanks sharing some of these capabilities, HR, finance, even monitoring evaluation. Sometimes small think tanks invest in having a male officer or somebody in charge of basically collecting information to report to funders. I wonder, Diana, once if you can reflect on what are the kind of things that when you're looking at finding a partner, and as you said before, as a funder, you are kind of trusting in them, the responsibility of developing the strategy and their approach. What are the kind of organizational characteristics or capabilities, capacities that you're looking for? I don't know if the word is due diligence, but certainly to understand the organization better and know that they will be a good, strong partner for you.
So, I mean, on the one hand, we have a few items in terms of thematic focus that are important for us. So on the one hand, we work with Pan-African think tanks, so not think tanks that work only domestically. We work with think tanks in the thematic area of socioeconomic transformation, and we try to cover all of Africa. So we try not to focus only on Eastern Africa, but really try to see that we spread around in terms of the partners that we have. In terms of structural issues, we actually look at established think tanks that help to strengthen the ecosystem and look at a broader scale, work again Pan-African and maybe also on global policy issues. And we also look at think tanks that actually have the capacities to work within organizations such as GIZ. So the administration has to be set up in a way that we, that they can deal with us, because we are a big animal and we have some financial administrative issues that we're looking at. But I think it's important to note that this is one project that GIZ is implementing on behalf of BMZ, but there's a lot of other projects, a lot of different funders. And I think it's always important to send the message that for all the think tanks, all the organizations seeking funding there, it's important to find your right investor. It's not just a donor that gives you money because they think that you're a great organization, but every funder has a different perspective and different needs and things that they need to fulfill or that they are seeking. So I think it's also good for think tanks to see who's the right funder for me. How are they connected to what I need? Are they, if you need to establish more MEL capacities, monitoring, evaluation, and learning capacities, maybe look for a funder that does that, or if you're a nascent think tank, look at funders that focus on this issue. So, try to streamline your fundraising and look at the right funders, because I think we also, for example, get a lot of requests from think tanks that are not relevant or that we can't deal with. And I think it's also important for think tanks to do the due diligence with potential funders to find the right match.
That's interesting. We need more information about what the funders are good for, to some extent, right? So it's not necessarily, it's a matchmaking effort, finding the right funder for the right organization, which can help you develop some different aspects of the organization. I think some think tanks tell us this, right? That they've been able to develop certain elements of the organization based on the relationship with some funders. But what about this other element of the organizational capabilities, which Camila raises? Chris, if I can go to you, about AI. I think this is something that we've been noting for a while now, and certainly from last year to this year, we've seen a big jump in the difference between adoption and the qualitative conversation, right? This is the quantitative finding, but the qualitative conversation and insights is that we also see more think tanks in higher income countries, not just adopting the AI tools, but working with them and using them and developing them. Whereas for the most part in lower income countries, we see them, if they are adopting them, they're just using the tools that are available to them, right? So they have very little control over how the tools work for them. What do you think about this, and what can think tanks do? What can funders do to try to bridge this divide? Or is this divide something we should worry about?
I think we should worry about it. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but I think this is how, I guess, it's sort of a microcosm of the development sector more broadly. Where the resources are, the technology moves faster and is used. Where it's developed, actually, it's developed for them, and then the rest of the world, I think, is just using what's been developed elsewhere. I think if you look at the existing models, AI models, for instance, and you look at the data that they've been trained on, it's not data from the majority South for the most part. It's data from the North and the West, which is where a lot of the data does exist. I think that's also our challenge, is that our data infrastructure isn't that great. We still have weak data infrastructure in our parts of the world. And so we're not participating as developers, we're participating as users. And I think what I see as the role of, I guess, philanthropy and development partners is ensuring that there is safe use of these types of technologies, that AI is used responsibly. I think we've all seen examples of where AI hallucinates because there's just not enough data about a particular context. And then the risk there is that think tanks then, in a way, I guess, seed their research analytical capacities to these tools that aren't representative of the communities that they seek to serve, and then use that and package that evidence and present it to government. Because we're saying you should reduce your costs, and perhaps then instead of doing a study, you just ask ChatGPT and it gives you recommendations, and you take those recommendations to the permanent secretary. And that does more harm than it does good. So I think there's a role for funders to think about, how do we safeguard communities? How do we ensure responsible use of these tools? How can Africans and organizations in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, participate in training these models, improving these models? I think efforts by the Agency Fund, for instance, where they're evaluating the AIs themselves. And so a nonprofit develops a chatbot, an AI chatbot. that engages with community health workers, and they are then going in to evaluate, like, how is this AI working? Is it safe? How accurate is it? Is it hallucinating? I think those efforts are super helpful in just ensuring that as this technology continues to evolve and develop, it's here, it's getting better, it's not going away, but that it's done in a way that's responsible and includes the participation of individuals and organizations in the majority South.
Thank you. I mean, again, you bring back collaboration, right? So learning about the use of the AI, sharing what you've learned with others, helping others sort of navigate with the technology that can certainly help do that. And I guess, Diana, in supporting organizations that are working at the regional level, trying to influence policy at the regional level, access to these technologies or being able to influence them is certainly going to be part of regional conversations. As in, for instance, the EU, where access to AI and development of AI is being discussed quite at the regional level. Now we've run out of time, so I want to try to bring us back to the final reflection, and just ask Camila, maybe from what you've heard, as the principal author of the report, what would you like us to leave with? What was some of the key messages or key ideas you would like us to take home?
So yes, I would like to highlight that this year report, I think that reaffirms the strategic clarity, the strong internal system, and the societal trust that in evidence that we have to start to explore, and it remains most powerful levers of think tank effectiveness. Those are the topics that we discussed today. I invite you to explore the other topics and the other findings. But as I said, in a context of rising uncertainty and equality and inequality, these are the foundations on which a stronger and more resilient sector must be built. Those three things: probably strategic clarity, strong internal systems, and this societal trust in evidence. So this I could highlight for today's findings. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Camila. And as I just want to point out to those that are asking some questions, this conversation has focused slightly on Africa, because both Diana and Christopher are working primarily there. But the report, of course, covers the whole world, and we are having conversations with think tanks in different regions and in different countries, and we'll be having those conversations throughout the next few months. And we will also invite anybody who is interested in accessing the report, or some of the data, some of the analysis, to visit our website to learn more about this, and to just get in touch with us, because we'll be more than happy to support local and regional conversations where these findings can be discussed in greater detail and with greater nuance. So Diana, Chris, Camila, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating conversation, as always. Once again, I want to encourage anybody and everyone to download the report if you haven't yet, to explore its findings and share your own insights with us and the global think tank community. You can listen and watch this episode or other episodes of the OTT Talks series by visiting onthinktanks.org, or wherever you listen to your podcast or watch your videos. This particular session, as I said, has been live streamed to YouTube, so you can find it there now. And from me and from the OTT team, goodbye. And thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.